What if Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization, but the last surviving memory of something far older? Just sit with that for a second. Imagine that this place, this site already called the world's oldest temple, wasn't built 11,000 years ago at the dawn of agriculture, but carved and raised tens of thousands of years before that, by hands we've never acknowledged, by minds we've been taught couldn't exist. Because if that were true, if Göbekli Tepe, whatever name you've heard it by, is older than the timeline says, it wouldn't just be a fascinating detail. It would collapse every textbook, every neat little chart of human progress, every comfortable assumption about where we came from and how we got here. Long before the first pharaohs ruled Egypt, before Sumer carved writing into clay, before the glaciers even began their final retreat, a forgotten people may have shaped stone with impossible precision, aligned pillars with stars lost to the turning ages, and then deliberately buried the entire complex beneath a hill. And that word, deliberately, matters. Because if something was intentionally sealed, then somebody wanted it protected, preserved, hidden. For what? To guard it from a coming catastrophe, to preserve knowledge too dangerous or too sacred to risk losing, or to leave behind a riddle for whoever came next. For us. Now, mainstream archaeology tells a very different story. The official position is that Göbekli Tepe was raised by simple hunter-gatherers, people wandering the hills with no cities, no writing, no wheels. Just flint tools, rope, and raw willpower. But the more you look at the site, the more it feels like the stones themselves are whispering. That story doesn't fit. The precision of the carvings, the depth of what looks like astronomical knowledge, the careful, methodical burial, all of it suggests something else. Lost cycles, erased legacies, truths pushed under the surface of accepted history. So tonight, we're reopening that story. Let the silence of the ancient pillars guide us. Let the evidence, fragile, persistent, unsettling, speak for itself. And let one question echo through the darkness. If Göbekli Tepe truly stands as a fragment of a world far older than we've been taught, what were its builders trying to tell us? And what did they fear we might forget? But before we go deeper, I want to pull you into this with me. Where in the world are you right now? What time is it as you're listening to these ancient whispers? Whether it's midnight in Tokyo, dawn in London, or dusk in California, we're all gathered beneath the same stars that watched Göbekli Tepe rise and fall. Drop your location and local time in the comments. And if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about human history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories go deep, and there's always more buried beneath the surface. Now, let the journey begin. Night settles across the Anatolian plateau. The wind moves slow over the hills of southeastern Turkey, carrying the scent of dry earth and wild thyme. Above the stars burn cold and bright, ancient witnesses to a history we've only just started to understand. And beneath that sky lies Göbekli Tepe. Mainstream archaeology calls it the world's first temple. T-shaped pillars rise from the ground like stone sentinels, frozen in place, some weighing 20 tons or more, carved with a confidence and precision that feels out of place in the age it's assigned to. Radiocarbon analysis dates the site's burial to around 9600 BC, putting it right at the edge of the last ice age. But here's the crack in the story. What if that date marks not the moment it was built, but the moment it was sealed? What if Göbekli Tepe isn't 11,000 years old, but far, far older? If that sounds extreme good, it should. Because accepting that possibility doesn't just tweak the timeline, it shatters it. It would mean that long before the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, long before the granite temples of the Nile, long before humanity supposedly learned to farm or build, a people walked these hills with knowledge vast enough to quarry massive stone, move it across rugged terrain, carve it with symbols we still struggle to interpret, and orient it to the sky, with a precision that suggests not guesswork, but long observation. Not a lucky night of stargazing, a system, a tradition. To accept that is to unravel the clean linear story we've been taught and admit that the history we know might be incomplete. Like a palimpsest, a manuscript, where the original text is scraped away and written over. But the older ink still haunts the page. And the evidence, even though it's fragile, keeps surfacing. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath the known enclosures, voids, strange signatures, hints of hidden chambers. Excavations of the visible site show something even stranger: layers of fill packed tightly around the pillars, compressed with a uniformity that doesn't look like nature. Wind and rain don't bury a complex like this with clean, consistent density. People do. What radiocarbon testing can measure is the organic material mixed into the fill bone's plant matter charcoal. That gives us the date of burial, the date of the covering. But the limestone pillars themselves, they hold no organic carbon. Stone can't be dated that way. It endures silent, stubborn, uncooperative. So, if the burial was intentional, if it was a response to some forgotten crisis, then the true origin of the pillars disappears into the shadows of prehistory. And that's exactly where Göbekli Tepe becomes dangerous to the timeline. Because archaeology, as a discipline, prefers certainty, clean layers, a story that fits the artifacts, a steady progression from simple to complex. Göbekli Tepe refuses to behave. Look closely at the stonework. The surfaces are smooth, the edges are crisp, the reliefs, lions, serpents, vultures, geometric forms are carved deep and confidently, with no sign of hesitation. No learning curve carved into the rock. These don't feel like the first attempts of wandering foragers experimenting with stone. They feel like the work of people who already knew what they were doing. People with practiced hands, with inherited skill or inherited memory. So the question becomes unavoidable. How could bands of hunter-gatherers, supposedly without settlements, mathematics, or large-scale organization, coordinate the construction of a site like this, unless they were carrying something forward from something older? Unless they were survivors. And that's where we have to start, right on the surface of the stone itself. Because if you want the truth about Göbekli Tepe, you don't begin in theory. You begin in what can be seen, touched, measured. So imagine for a moment standing there in the night, walking up to one of those towering, shaped pillars, and ask yourself, what kind of hands made this picture it clearly? You're standing inside one of the circular enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. The air is dry. The ground is uneven. The pillars around you rise like a ring of frozen silhouettes, each one towering above your head, each one cut into a clean T-shape that feels almost intentional in a way that goes beyond simple structure, like they're meant to represent something. And as you step closer to the stone, the first thing you notice is the surface. Because it isn't rough, it isn't jagged, it isn't primitive. In places, the limestone feels smooth, almost polished. The edges are sharp, the angles are deliberate, and the carvings, they aren't shallow scratches like cave art. These are deep incisions cut confidently into hard stone, sometimes several inches deep, with a steadiness that tells you one thing right away. Whoever did this wasn't guessing. They weren't experimenting. They weren't learning. They were executing. You see lions with a kind of controlled power in their posture. Serpents, coiled in a way that suggests careful observation. Vultures with wings spread wide bodies carved in raised relief feathers, hinted at with lines that are too consistent to be accidental. There are foxes, bulls, scorpions, cranes, animals rendered with anatomical awareness. Not photorealistic, of course, but accurate enough that you feel the artist knew these creatures intimately. And then there are the symbols, the abstract marks that don't immediately resolve into art. H-shapes, crescents, circles, nested boxes, lines that are straight and clean curves that hold their geometry. And that's where something shifts inside you. Because once you've seen enough ancient sites, you start to recognize a pattern. Early carving tends to look uncertain. You can almost feel the hesitation, the hand trying, stopping, correcting. Göbekli Tepe doesn't look like that. It looks like a place built by people who already had a tradition of carving. Like this wasn't the beginning of their skill, but the continuation of it. Mainstream archaeology will tell you this was done with flint tools. And technically, yes, flint can cut limestone. It's sharp, it can chip and scrape. But flint is also brittle, and controlling it for deep uniform carving across tons of stone would be unbelievably time-consuming. Now multiply that labor across dozens of pillars, across multiple enclosures, with a consistent style and confidence. Either these people devoted an astonishing portion of their lives, generations purely to stonework, or they had techniques we don't fully understand. Tools that left no trace, methods that vanished with them. And that's just the carving, because carving is the quiet part of the mystery. The loud part is moving the stones. Let's talk about weight. Some of the main pillars are estimated between 10 and 20 tons, some possibly more. That's not big rock weight. That's modern construction equipment weight. The quarries are nearby, hundreds of meters away, carved right out of the limestone bedrock. You can still see the scars, rectangular voids where blocks were cut free. Evidence of extraction clear as a signature. But cutting the stone is only step one. Step two is the part where the timeline starts to tremble. How do you move a 15-ton pillar across uneven ground, uphill, with no wheels, no draft animals, no metal tools, no cranes, just rope woven from plant fibers and human muscle? Even if you had wooden rollers, think about controlling that kind of weight on a slope. One mistake, one slip, and you don't just fail, you lose the stone, you crush people, you ruin months of effort. And the official explanation is manpower. Dozens, maybe hundreds, pulling in unison, using sledges, levers, ropes. And yes, in theory, human labor can do extraordinary things. But that raises a second problem: organization. Because large-scale labor isn't just strength. It's planning. It's leadership. It's coordination. It's feeding people while they work. It's scheduling repetition, a system that can sustain itself across long projects. That's not how mobile bands usually live. Hunter-gatherers survive by moving with seasons. You don't normally stop everything for months or years to build a monumental complex, unless the complex is the center of your world, unless your society is stable enough to support that level of effort. So, we're stuck with a paradox. We're told this was built by people with no permanent settlements. but it requires the kind of sustained organization that usually comes after settlement. And then there's the final problem, raising the pillars. Moving them is one thing. Standing them upright is another. To set a 20-ton monolith into a socket carved into bedrock, upright, balanced, aligned, you need not just muscle, but engineering awareness. You need a sense of angles, leverage, tension, timing. You need methods refined through practice, because the margin for error is razor thin. Tilt too far and it shatters. Too little and it topples. Modern cranes do this with hydraulics and controlled balance. Göbekli Tepe's builders, in the official story, did it with wood rope and coordination. So again, how? And here's where the story opens outward, beyond Turkey, beyond this one hill. Because if Göbekli Tepe feels too advanced, it isn't the only place that triggers that feeling. Across the world, there are other sites far apart, separated by oceans, and supposedly separated by thousands of years, that share a strange family resemblance. Massive stone blocks moved and placed with extreme precision, cuts and joints that feel machined, alignments that suggest astronomy, and ages that push against what we're told should be possible. Take Pumapunku high in Bolivia. There are blocks there carved with interlocking grooves, flat surfaces so accurate they look like they came out of a factory. Some stones are andesite and diorite, extremely hard materials, and yet the cuts are sharp, clean, repeatable. There are drill holes so uniform they look almost modern. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges the precision, then shrugs and moves on. Or Baalbek in Lebanon. At the base of the Roman temple complex, the Trilithon, 3 giant blocks each, around 800 tons. Beneath those even larger stones. One famous block in the quarry is estimated over 1,000 tons. That's the kind of weight that makes even modern engineers pause. And yet these stones were cut, moved, and set with a fit so tight a blade can't slip between them. Then there's Gunung Padang in Indonesia, often called a terraced pyramid. For years, it was dismissed as a natural hill until surveys and samples suggested deeper layers, older layers with structured construction. Some contested claims place parts of it far earlier than conventional history would like to allow. And offshore Yonaguni, near Japan, a submerged structure like formation terraces, right angles, steps. Some geologists insist it's natural. Others argue the shapes are too geometric to ignore. If it was above water once, then whatever happened there happened before sea levels rose. So now the question shifts. Because when you see one anomaly, you can call it a fluke. But when anomalies start forming a pattern across continents, across time, something else begins to whisper. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't an isolated miracle, but part of a larger story? A story where advanced stonework appears earlier than expected, not once, but again and again. And if that's true, then maybe the biggest mistake we make is assuming every culture is starting from zero. Maybe some were rebuilding. Maybe some were remembering. Maybe some were survivors carrying fragments of knowledge forward from an age that ended in disaster. And if that thought makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it flips the entire direction of history. It suggests that the oldest work might not be the crudest. It suggests that what we call beginnings might actually be returns. And if Göbekli Tepe's builders carried knowledge forward, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where did that knowledge come from? If the stones won't give us an easy date, maybe the sky will. Because carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars are patterns that don't just point to animals. They point upward, toward constellations, toward a celestial clock that moves slowly, predictably, and most importantly, can be rewound. And once we start rewinding the sky, the timeline gets even stranger. If stone is stubborn, the sky is honest. That's the thing about the heavens, they don't care what we believe. They don't adjust to our timelines. They don't bend to our theories. The stars move slowly, quietly, relentlessly, and that motion creates something we can use like a cosmic timestamp. Because the sky changes. Not dramatically in one night, not in a way you notice from year to year, but over thousands of years, the entire dome shifts. Constellations drift. Stars rise in slightly different places. What once lined up perfectly with a horizon or a monument slowly slides away. And that drift has a name: precession of the equinoxes. It's the wobble in Earth's rotational axis, like a spinning top that isn't perfectly upright. That wobble takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. You don't see it in a human lifetime. You barely detect it across generations. But over millennia, it's unmistakable. And if the carvings and alignments at Göbekli Tepe truly encode astronomy, if they're mapping a sky, then precession becomes a clock. A way to rewind the heavens and ask a dangerous question. When did the sky look like what's carved here? Because that's the moment the carvings point toward, whether the builders observed it directly or inherited the knowledge from someone who did. And at the center of this mystery stands one of the most debated stones on Earth, Pillar 43. Often called the vulture stone. Even the name feels like a clue, doesn't it? As if we've already decided what it is. A vulture, an animal symbol, a religious icon. But once you've stared at it long enough, you start to realize how much is packed into that one slab of limestone. At the top, a large bird wings spread, commonly labeled a vulture. Beneath it, a scorpion tail, arched, unmistakable. Around them, circles, abstract shapes, what looks like a headless figure, other animals, other marks that don't neatly translate into totem or clan badge. For years, archaeologists treated it like symbolic art, perhaps related to death rituals, sky burials, spiritual beliefs. And that could be true. But then researchers from archaeoastronomy started asking something else. What if these aren't just animals? What if they're constellations? Because humans have always used animals to map the sky. Even today, our constellations are filled with creatures: scorpions, lions, bulls, birds. You don't need a telescope to do that. You need memory pattern, recognition tradition. So, some researchers propose that the scorpion on Pillar 43 is Scorpius. And once you accept that possibility, the whole pillar becomes a map. The bird might correspond to another constellation. Some have suggested Cygnus, others Aquila, others symbols in a now lost star tradition. The circles could represent stars or markers. The arrangement begins to look less like random mythic art and more like a structured diagram. And when people start matching the layout against reconstructed ancient skies, things get unsettling, because the alignments don't comfortably sit in 9 to 600 BC. Some interpretations point toward dates around 10,950 BC, roughly 13,000 years ago, near the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Others suggest the sky match works better even earlier, deep into the last ice age. Now, I need to be careful here. Not every researcher agrees. Some interpretations are contested, some are debated. But the very fact that there are serious researchers trying to date Göbekli Tepe through the stars tells you something. The site behaves like it's preserving information, not just building shelter, not just making art. It behaves like a message. And Pillar 43 isn't the only hint. Other enclosures appear to have orientations that suggest deliberate celestial planning. Some researchers point to Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Its heliacal rising, the first appearance before dawn after it's been hidden, has been used by cultures worldwide as a seasonal marker. Others point toward Orion, the hunter constellation, whose belt has obsessed humans from ancient Egypt to Mesoamerica. Some even suggest solstice alignments, the sun's turning points, the high and low edges of the year. And here's the key point. To build consistent astronomical alignments, you need continuity. You need repeated observation from the same place across many years. You need a tradition that survives long enough to notice patterns. To track precession, you need more than tradition. You need time, an almost terrifying amount of time, because precession moves so slowly that you'd have to compare the sky across many generations to truly see it. It's not like noticing the moon's phases. It's not like noticing where the sun rises in summer versus winter. It's a slow, creeping shift. So if Göbekli Tepe's carvings encode precessional knowledge, if they reflect a sky that's older than the accepted date, then we have two possibilities, and both are massive. One, the builders themselves observed the sky across an extremely long span of time, generation after generation, preserving precise knowledge without writing. Two, they inherited that knowledge, passed down through stories, symbols, rituals, then carved into stone as an archive. And either way, it doesn't fit the simple wandering forager's narrative. Because to preserve astronomical knowledge across generations, you need cultural stability. You need systems. Even if it's not written language, it has to be something structured, something that resists drift. And if they did inherit it, then the question becomes even sharper. Inherited from who? This isn't the first time ancient astronomy has cracked open uncomfortable doors. Consider Nabta Playa in southern Egypt. Stone circles aligned with celestial events, often dated older than Stonehenge. It suggests organized skywatching in prehistoric times. That's already a challenge to the simplistic primitive label. Or consider Stonehenge itself. The precision of the solstice alignment isn't accidental. It was built and refined over long periods. It shows what sustained effort, continuity, and shared purpose can do. But again, those examples fall within a relatively acceptable window. Göbekli Tepe doesn't. And then there's the big controversial one, Giza and the Orion correlation theory. The idea debated, rejected by many, defended passionately by others, is that the three pyramids mirror Orion's belt, and that the correlation fits best not in the Old Kingdom sky, but in a much earlier epoch, around 10 to 500 BC. Mainstream Egyptology pushes back hard, and for fair reasons, the evidence is not clean, the arguments are contested. But the reason it keeps returning is simple. It's another instance of people noticing that some ancient structures behave as if they're referencing deep time, as if they're preserving a memory. And that's what keeps happening around Göbekli Tepe. Every time you try to lock it into a neat Neolithic origin story, it leaks out through the edges. The craft is too confident. The scale is too heavy. The alignments feel too intentional. And then, as if the builders knew this would happen, as if they knew people in the future would argue over dates and meanings, they did something even stranger. They buried it, not abandoned it, not left it to crumble. They sealed it. And that changes everything, because if you see a structure buried systematically with methodical fill with care, you aren't looking at natural ruin. You're looking at a decision, a final act. So now we have to ask the question that refuses to go away. Why would anyone bury something like this? Why spend years or decades building a monumental stone complex, only to cover it in thousands of tons of material that isn't neglect. That's intention. And once we step into the story of the burial, once we examine what the soil itself is telling us, the possibility of catastrophe stops being a dramatic idea and starts looking like an explanation. Because the earth doesn't bury Göbekli Tepe like that. People do. And people usually do that for one reason. They believe something is coming. When archaeologists first began excavating Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s, they expected something familiar. Because most ancient sites, especially ones this old, don't survive cleanly. Time tends to break everything down in the same ways. Walls collapse, stones tumble, wind drifts, sand unevenly rain channels soil into random pockets. Erosion leaves messy layers that look like nature doing what nature does. But Göbekli Tepe didn't look like that. It looked packed, sealed, as if the site wasn't simply abandoned and forgotten, but deliberately closed. And that's one of the most under-discussed, most unsettling parts of this whole story. Because the enclosures were filled with thousands of tons of material sediment mixed with limestone chips, animal bones, broken tools, stuff that looks like it was brought in and placed, layered, compacted, evenly distributed. Natural erosion doesn't do that. Erosion is chaotic. It leaves irregular deposition. It leaves signs of water flow, wind patterning, air gaps, inconsistent composition. But the fill at Göbekli Tepe appears uniform, like someone was methodically burying it on purpose, like sealing a vault or closing a tomb. And immediately, a question rises that is so simple you can't dodge it. Why would you bury something like this? Because think about what it represents. Quarrying massive stone, carving reliefs, transporting monoliths uphill, raising them upright, arranging them in circles, aligning them with something, whether stars, seasons, or ritual. That's a staggering investment of labor. Years, maybe decades, maybe longer. And then after building something that would have been the centerpiece of a culture, they covered it completely. Not a little symbolic ritual covering, not a "we're done here, let's move on" kind of burial. Meters of compacted material, enough to hide it from the world, enough to protect it from weathering, enough to make sure it stayed silent. And archaeology has proposed explanations, but none of them fully satisfy the scale. One idea is ritual closure. We know many cultures close sacred spaces when an era ends. In parts of Mesoamerica, temples were sometimes filled and built over layers stacked like chapters in a long religious story. In some traditions, old shrines are symbolically sealed when their purpose changes, so yes, ritual closure exists. But Göbekli Tepe's burial doesn't feel symbolic. It feels industrial. It feels like it required a massive, organized workforce. And that pushes us right back into the same contradiction. You need a stable society to pull that off. So maybe it wasn't just ritual. Another idea, protection from enemies. Maybe the builders feared rival groups. Maybe they wanted to hide the site to prevent desecration or theft. But if we're talking about the period around 9600 BC, the region was sparsely populated, bands of foragers scattered. There's no clear evidence of large-scale warfare, no mass fortifications, no obvious enemy threat that would justify burying an entire monumental complex. It feels like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly, unless the threat wasn't human. Which leads to the third possibility, the one that changes the entire tone of the story, catastrophe. What if they buried it because they believed the world was about to shift? What if they saw something coming, a disaster so severe that the only thing they could do was hide what mattered most? Knowledge symbols, sacred architecture, beneath the earth, where it might survive. Now that might sound dramatic, like the kind of thing you'd expect in a movie. But here's the problem. The geological record agrees that something dramatic happened. Around 12,900 years ago, Earth entered an abrupt climate reversal known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plunged, ice advanced again, ecosystems collapsed, megafauna died off across huge regions. The change wasn't gradual, it wasn't slow, it was sudden, like someone slammed on the brakes of the warming world. And the cause, that's still debated. But over the last few decades, a controversial yet persistent hypothesis has gained attention: a cosmic impact. Fragments of a comet or asteroid striking the planet, possibly over the northern hemisphere. And researchers have pointed to strange evidence in sediment, layers, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium spikes, materials associated with high heat, high pressure extraterrestrial impacts. They've described widespread soot and charcoal, consistent with massive wildfires. Now, to be clear, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is debated. There are scientists who support it and scientists who challenge it. But the key point is that the Younger Dryas was real, sudden, and severe. And even without a cosmic impact, the end of the Ice Age was a chaotic, violent transition. Global temperatures shifted, ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose dramatically. Between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose more than 100 meters, over 300 feet. Whole coastlines vanished. Continental shelves that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years drowned under the ocean. Think about what that means. If human settlements, like today, clustered near coasts, rivers, and fertile lowlands, then the rising seas would have erased them. And what would remain? High ground, plateaus, hilltops, places like Göbekli Tepe. So, if people experienced this transition, if they watched lands flood, storms intensify, climates shift, ecosystems fail, then burying a sacred complex starts to make sense. Not as abandonment, as preservation, as a desperate act of saving what couldn't be carried. And this brings us to the most speculative, but also the most haunting possibility. What if Göbekli Tepe was meant to be a time capsule, not just a temple, not just a gathering site, but a repository, a library written in stone? Because stone is durable, but exposed stone erodes. It cracks, it weathers, it gets vandalized. But stone buried underground, protected from wind, rain, sunlight, human interference, that can last for an unbelievably long time. So, if the builders believed the world above was about to change, if they believed catastrophe was coming, then sealing the site beneath earth becomes a kind of insurance. A message buried for whoever survived, or whoever came later. And here's something else that makes this feel less far-fetched. Göbekli Tepe isn't the only place where people sealed something. Across the world, cultures have buried chambers, sealed tunnels, concealed sacred spaces, sometimes as ritual, sometimes as protection, sometimes as preservation. In Malta, for example, there's the Hypogeum, a subterranean temple complex carved into bedrock. It was used for rituals and burials, and later it was filled and sealed. Entrances hidden, chambers packed. In the Andes, sealed caves and plugged tunnels have been found with artifacts preserved inside, as if meant to be hidden from time. The impulse is ancient and universal. When you fear loss, you hide what matters. And if the end of the Ice Age was truly that violent, then human memory would carry scars of it. Even if the details blurred, the emotional core would remain. The world can end, the world can flood, the world can burn. And if you can't stop it, you preserve what you can. So now let's put the pieces together. Radiocarbon dating tells us roughly when Göbekli Tepe was buried, but it doesn't tell us when the pillars were carved. And if the burial was intentional, if it was a response to catastrophe, then the site could have already been old when it was sealed, thousands of years old, possibly more. So the question becomes sharper and more dangerous. How old was Göbekli Tepe when they buried it? Because if it was new, built only a short time before burial, then the burial is strange, but maybe explainable as ritual. But if it was already ancient, already standing for a long time, then burying it looks like desperation. A final act of a world that knew it was about to be erased. And that leads directly to the next question, the one that makes people uncomfortable. If a civilization existed before Göbekli Tepe, where is it? Where are the cities, the roads, the tools, the writing? Why don't we have piles of evidence everywhere? And the answer might be simple, brutal, and geological. Because catastrophe doesn't just kill people. It erases landscapes. It drowns coastlines. It burns forests into ash. It scrubs history clean. And if something truly happened at the Younger Dryas boundary, something sudden enough to reset ecosystems and reshape coastlines, then it could also reset human history. It could wipe out the evidence we'd expect, leaving only scattered fragments like Göbekli Tepe. But to understand how something like that could happen, how an entire world could be erased, we need to look at the record the Earth keeps best, the ice, the sediment, the black lines in the ground that mark the boundary between before and after. Because if Göbekli Tepe feels like a survivor, then the disaster it survived might be the real story hiding underneath everything. Or it was ground down. Or it was buried like Göbekli Tepe. And that burial starts looking less like an odd cultural habit and more like a survival strategy. Because if you can't save your cities, if you can't stop the flood, if the climate is collapsing around you, what do? You take what you can preserve, symbols, knowledge, alignment, systems, sacred architecture, and you anchor it in stone on high ground where the sea can't reach. Then you seal it, you hide it from the chaos, you try to make it last. And this is where myth suddenly becomes relevant not as fantasy, but as the shadow of memory. Because across the world, cultures separated by oceans tell the same kinds of stories: a great flood, fire from the sky darkness, the end of an age, survivors carrying knowledge forward, the Sumerian flood story, the epic of Gilgamesh, Noah, Manu, Deucalion, stories of lands swallowed and humanity reset. For centuries, we've treated these narratives like moral tales, archetypes, metaphors, psychological myths. But what if they're also trauma echoes? What if they're the emotional memory of real events passed down orally across generations because there was no writing to hold the details steady? Oral tradition can preserve astonishing things. Some indigenous Australian stories, for example, describe coastlines that match sea level changes thousands of years old. Not perfectly in modern terms, but enough to suggest real geographic memory can survive when it's encoded into story and ritual. So imagine survivors of catastrophe telling their children the sea rose. The sky burned, the world ended. Over time, comet fragments becomes fire from the gods. Atmospheric dust becomes the sun was hidden. Tsunamis become the ocean, swallowed the land. the core truth remains, even as the language shifts. And if survivors carried knowledge, astronomy, engineering, sacred symbols, how would they preserve it? They could speak it, they could sing it, they could ritualize it, and eventually, if they found stability again, they could carve it into stone. Which brings us right back to Göbekli Tepe. Because when you look at the site through this lens, the pieces align in a way that feels too neat to ignore. A monumental complex on high ground, built with skill that seems inherited, oriented as though it's referencing the sky, buried deliberately as if preservation mattered more than visibility, sealed around a time when the world was undergoing violent change. And suddenly, Göbekli Tepe doesn't feel like the first temple. It feels like a memorial, a repository, a message left by people who feared forgetting, or feared that we would forget. And then the question sharpens again, because it's one thing to say catastrophe could erase a civilization. It's another thing to explain why the sites that remain, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Pumapunku, and others, share eerie similarities. Shared symbols, shared obsessions with stone, shared precision, shared alignment with the heavens. If these are fragments of a larger story, then Göbekli Tepe may not be alone. It may be one surviving page from a library that burned. And if that's true, then the next step isn't just asking what destroyed the old world. It's asking what connects the fragments that survived. Because once you start comparing these sites side by side, across continents, across oceans, you begin to see patterns that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And the deeper you go into those patterns, the more it begins to feel like we're not looking at isolated miracles. We're looking at echoes. If catastrophe erased a world, it didn't erase everything. It left fragments, hard, stubborn, durable fragments, stone on high ground symbols, carved deep enough to survive alignments, built with a patience that outlasts entire cultures. And when you start laying those fragments side by side, something unsettling happens. You begin to see patterns. Not perfect copies, not a clean, same culture everywhere stamp, but repeating motifs, repeating obsessions, repeating engineering fingerprints, like different groups holding pieces of the same broken mirror. Let's start with symbols, because symbols are how people carry ideas across time. At Göbekli Tepe, you see certain shapes again and again, H-like forms, crescents, circles, nested, rectangles, abstract marks that don't translate neatly into decoration. They feel like they belong to a system, either a proto-language, a code, or something ritualized enough that it has rules. Now travel across the world to Pumapunku, high in the Bolivian Altiplano. There among the huge stones you find something that makes you do a double take, H-shaped cuts and grooves that look eerily familiar, not just vaguely similar, structurally similar, repeated, standardized, like a design template. And the craftsmanship there is unnerving. The stone blocks at Pumapunku aren't just large. Some are extremely hard rock, andesite, and diorite materials that are notoriously difficult to shape, even with metal tools. Yet the surfaces are flat, the angles are sharp. The cuts look repeatable, as if the builders were producing components meant to interlock. That's not the natural roughness you expect from early stonework. It feels engineered. And here's the real problem. According to mainstream timelines, Göbekli Tepe and Pumapunku are separated by thousands of years and an entire ocean. No known contact, no known cultural bridge. So, why do you see similar motifs, similar design instincts, similar precision? Coincidence is possible. But coincidence gets weaker every time the pattern repeats. Now let's widen the view. Spirals show up everywhere in ancient symbolism. Newgrange in Ireland, rock art in the American Southwest, carvings in Australia, motifs in ancient Europe and Asia. You can argue spirals are universal because humans see spirals in nature, shells, storms, galaxies. Fair. But when spirals appear alongside other repeating symbols, alongside consistent animal iconography, alongside sky alignment obsessions, then the spiral stops being just a spiral and starts looking like part of a broader symbolic language that many cultures tap into. And then there's the engineering. Because the engineering parallels are harder to wave away than symbol parallels. Take Baalbek in Lebanon. At the base of a Roman temple complex sit foundation stones that make modern people just stand there and stare. 3 massive blocks in the trilithon, often estimated around 800 tons each. Nearby, even larger stones in the quarry, sometimes estimated over 1,000 tons. Whether every number is perfectly accurate or not, the scale is undeniable. And the fit is astonishing tight joints, straight-cut stones, seated as if precision mattered as much as mass. The Romans built on top of this foundation, but they didn't claim the deepest layers as their own achievement, the way you'd expect if it were purely their work. It's like they inherited something they respected or feared enough to leave untouched. And again, we hit the same question. How do you move and place stones of that size with pre-industrial technology? Even today, moving a 1,000-ton block isn't casual. It's a major engineering project. And yet Baalbek exists. Pumapunku exists. Göbekli Tepe exists. Different places, different times. Same haunting question. Now take another step outward, the ocean. Because if the Ice Age ended in floods and rising seas, then the ocean is not just a barrier between cultures. It's a vault full of drowned history. And all over the world, underwater anomalies keep showing up. Yonaguni, Japan terraces and steps under the sea. Off India, submerged structures and anchors, sometimes linked to legendary drowned cities. In the Mediterranean, sunken ruins along coasts that were once much farther out. In the Black Sea, submerged shorelines, shapes that suggest human activity where water now sits. And then there are the most extreme claims like deep underwater sonar images near Cuba, showing geometric formations far below where post-Ice Age flooding would normally explain. Those claims are controversial and debated, but the fact that we keep finding anything underwater at all reminds us of something important. We have barely explored the seafloor. We are, in a very literal sense, mostly blind to the biggest archaeological landscape change in human history. So, if an older civilization existed and lived along coastlines like humans naturally tend to do, then much of it may have been erased below the waves. Not because it wasn't real, but because it's inaccessible, which means what we have left on land might be the leftovers, high-ground monuments, stonework meant to endure sites that were either safe from rising water or intentionally placed where they could survive. And once you accept that the pattern of high-ground megaliths becomes far more meaningful. Look at Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Massive, irregular stones fitted together so tightly you can't slip paper between them. The joints are complex, like puzzle pieces, and yet the fit is perfect. Look at Nan Madol in Micronesia, massive basalt columns stacked into artificial islands. Complex construction on a remote set of islands that raises the same questions. How was this organized, transported, executed? Look at Easter Island. The Moai statues, their quarrying and transport still debated their meaning, still mysterious, their culture carrying oral traditions of earlier times and lost knowledge. And then you step back and realize you've seen the same fingerprints again and again. Huge stones moved with unknown methods, precision beyond what the official tools seem capable of, repeated symbolic motifs across the ancient world, alignments to the sky solstices, stars, and in some cases, concealment burial or sealing, as if preservation mattered. So what ties it together? The radical hypothesis that starts to form is simple. These aren't independent inventions. These are echoes. Fragments of an older knowledge tradition, maybe not a single empire, but a network of ideas, techniques, and symbols that once spread farther than we imagine. And when catastrophe struck, floods, climate collapse, coastal drowning, that network shattered. What remained were isolated groups, each holding partial memory. Some held engineering traditions. Some held astronomy. Some held symbolic language. Some held mythic memory of the disaster itself. And as generations passed, the fragments drifted, changed, localized. But the core patterns survived like fingerprints carried through time. Now, this is where critics will push back, and it's fair to acknowledge why. Mainstream archaeology prefers explanations that don't require a global lost civilization, because the evidence for global civilization in deep prehistory is not clean. We don't have clear writing. We don't have unmistakable industrial debris. We don't have a continuous chain of artifacts connecting all these places. But here's the counterpoint. Catastrophe plus sea level rise plus time is a brutal eraser. Wood rots, cloth decays, metals corrode, coastal cities drown. Oral knowledge shifts. What survives best? Stone. And even stone doesn't survive easily unless it's protected, buried, or placed where erosion is slow. So we may be in a situation where the only things that make it across the abyss are the hardest fragments, which means our picture of the past is biased toward what survives, not toward what existed. And Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately preserved under earth, might be one of the clearest examples of something that was designed to outlast disaster. That's why it feels like a keystone. Because if Göbekli Tepe is truly older than the official story, it becomes a clue that the fragments aren't random, they're remnants of a larger past. And if these remnants share patterns, symbols, precision, sky alignment, then maybe those patterns aren't coincidence. Maybe they're inheritance. And that leads us into the place where history becomes almost uncomfortable to look at. Because the more we talk about inheritance, the more we have to confront what preserves inheritance. Best stories, myths, oral traditions that travel through time like ships through fog, warped, reshaped, but still carrying something real. And when you compare the myths across the world, you find something that's hard to dismiss. They describe the same kinds of catastrophes geology records. Floods, fire from the sky, darkness, civilizations wiped out, survivors rebuilding. In other words, the story that the stones are hinting at is the same story the myths have been shouting for thousands of years. So maybe the next step isn't just comparing sites. Maybe it's listening to what the oldest stories say happened to the world before ours. Because if Göbekli Tepe is a survivor, then the myths may be the memory of what it survived. Here's where everything gets weird in the best and worst way. Because stones can hint, but stories can speak. Across every inhabited continent, in cultures separated by oceans and by thousands of years, you find the same themes repeating like an echo, a world before this one. A great flood, fire from the sky, a collapse so complete it reset humanity. And survivors, always survivors carrying something forward. For centuries, scholars treated these tales like myth in the dismissive sense. Beautiful fictions, moral lessons, symbolic dramas meant to teach values, explain storms, explain death, explain the unknown. But what if that's only half true? What if mythology is also memory, distorted, ritualized, reshaped by time, but rooted in real events? Because if the Earth records catastrophe in sediment, and ice, humans record it in narrative. And narratives don't always preserve data the way modern science wants them to. They preserve emotion, meaning, warning, trauma. They preserve the shape of an event even if the details get wrapped in gods and monsters. So, let's look at some of these stories not to prove them as literal, but to ask what they might be remembering. Start with one of the oldest written civilizations we know, Sumer. There's a document called the Sumerian King List, an ancient record that tries to describe the lineage of rulers stretching back into deep antiquity. But when you reach the earliest kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, the numbers become absurd. Reigns of tens of thousands of years, Ululim ruling for 800 years, Alalgar for 36,000, Dumuzid for 28,800. Modern scholars typically say, clearly symbolic, and maybe they are. But symbolic of what? What if those reigns aren't meant as human lifespans? What if they're epics, dynasties, cycles? A way of saying the world before the flood lasted a very, very long time and was fundamentally different from the world after, because the king list draws a clear dividing line. Before the flood, everything is enormous, time rulers scale. After the flood, the numbers snap back to human reality. Decades, not millennia. And right there, embedded in one of humanity's oldest written records, is the same idea that keeps appearing everywhere else. There was an age before, then a catastrophe, then a reset. And the flood isn't just rain. In these stories, it's world-ending. It wipes out the old order entirely. Only a chosen survivor escapes Ziusudra in Sumer, later echoed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, later echoed again in Noah. Same skeleton, different costume. Now moved to Egypt. Ancient Egyptian traditions speak of Zep-Tepi the first time. Not the first dynasty, not the start of the Old Kingdom, but an age before recorded history when gods or semi-divine beings walked the land and established the foundations of civilization. Egyptian temple inscriptions talk about wise beings arriving, teaching sacred knowledge, laying out cosmic order. Some texts describe these beings as coming from a land that had been destroyed, sometimes drowned. Mainstream scholars usually interpret this as mythic legitimacy, later pharaohs claiming divine ancestry. But the wording is persistent. It isn't just "we are blessed," it's "we inherited," "we rebuilt," "we are restoring something older." And that idea restoration rather than invention is exactly what Göbekli Tepe seems to whisper if you look at its craft and alignments. Then there's the story that refuses to die Atlantis. Plato is the source most people know, and for centuries, it's been treated as allegory, a moral lesson about hubris, corruption, and downfall. But again, the details are strangely specific. Plato says Solon was told the story by Egyptian priests. The priests described cycles of destruction, fire, and flood, wiping out civilizations, leaving survivors only in certain places. And the priests gave a date, roughly 9,000 years before Solon. That places Atlantis' destruction around 9600 BC. And whether you believe Atlantis was real or not, notice how that date keeps surfacing. 9600 BC is also around the time Göbekli Tepe was buried, according to radiocarbon dating. It's also around the period when the Younger Dryas ended and warming resumed, when seas were rising, when the world was transforming violently. So even if Atlantis is partly myth, it may still be remembering something real: the drowning of coastal lands, the collapse of a pre-existing world, a civilization, advanced or not, that disappeared under water and chaos. Now cross the ocean and listen to the Americas. The Hopi speak of world ages, multiple worlds, each destroyed in turn. One ended in fire, one in ice, one in flood. We live in the current world, they say, and it too can end if balance is lost. The Maya record cycles of creation and destruction. In their sacred narratives, humanity is created, destroyed, recreated, multiple attempts, multiple resets. Polynesian oral traditions speak of ancient deluges of lands that sank, of coastlines that disappeared. Some navigation chants describe islands and shores that no longer exist. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime traditions preserve astonishing geographic memory stories that describe sea level rise, coastline changes, islands becoming separated in ways that align with what we know happened after the Ice Age. And these traditions are not written. They're sung, performed, repeated with ritual precision. So when someone says oral tradition can't preserve anything accurately for long, the Dreamtime stories stand there like a challenge. Actually, sometimes it can. If the knowledge is culturally important enough and transmitted carefully enough, it can survive far longer than we assume. Now add another repeating theme to the global myth, library, fire from the sky. The Greeks told the story of Phaethon, who lost control of the sun chariot and scorched the earth. You could read that as a metaphor, or as a memory of a sky event, something burning, falling, igniting the world. In many indigenous American traditions, stars fall and fires spread across the plains. In parts of Hindu tradition, celestial weapons blaze so bright they reduce cities to ash again, easy to dismiss as fantasy, until you realize how many cultures describe a moment when the sky became dangerous. And if the Younger Dryas boundary really did involve impacts or airbursts, wildfires, atmospheric dust, then fire from the sky becomes less like fiction and more like how people would describe an incomprehensible cosmic event using the only language they had. Then there's the motif of darkness, the sun hidden, days without light, skies choked. That shows up too. And if you imagine massive fires, impacts throwing debris into the atmosphere, dust, darkening sunlight, sudden cooling, then the sun disappeared isn't poetic. It's literal experience. So here's the uncomfortable alignment. Geology describes a period of abrupt climate catastrophe. Sea levels rose dramatically and drowned ancient coastlines. Sediments contain strange materials consistent with extreme events. And mythology across the world describes floods, fire, darkness, and resets. Is it proof? No. But it's a pattern. And when you place Göbekli Tepe into that pattern, something clicks. Because Göbekli Tepe is not just a site with impressive pillars. It behaves like a monument built with the mindset of people who understood fragility. People who understood that the world can change fast. People who cared enough to preserve something. And if the myths are memory, then Göbekli Tepe might be the physical anchor, of that memory. A stone archive left behind when other records were impossible. Because what medium survives catastrophe? Not paper, not cloth, not digital memory, stone. Now, this doesn't mean the myths are literally true in every detail. It means the myths might be encoding something older than our written history, a memory of catastrophe and rebuilding preserved because it mattered too much to forget. And if that's true, then it changes what we're looking at when we see Göbekli Tepe. We're not just looking at the first temple built by hunter-gatherers. We might be looking at the bridge between a lost world and a new one, a place where survivors, or the descendants of survivors, gathered to preserve symbols, alignments, warnings, and knowledge. Which brings us to the biggest challenge of all. The mainstream story of human progress is linear, but the myth story is cyclical. Worlds begin, worlds end, worlds begin again. So what if the myths aren't just stories? What if they're describing a true pattern? A cycle of civilization, rising, collapsing, and being rebuilt again and again until most of the evidence is washed away. If that cycle exists, then Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization. It's a restart point, a marker of recovery, a place where someone tried to keep the memory alive. And if that's the case, then we have to confront the question that overturns everything we're taught. What if civilization didn't climb steadily upward from primitive to advanced? What if it's risen before and fallen before? Because once you start seeing the past as cyclical rather than linear, a lot of mysteries stop being mysteries. They become remnants. They become echoes. And the next place we have to go is the timeline itself, the official story we've all been handed, and the cracks you can't unsee once you notice them. Because if Göbekli Tepe is a restart point, then the so-called first civilizations might not be first at all. They might be the next wave. We've all been taught the same story about ourselves. It's clean, it's comforting, it feels like progress. Humans start out as simple hunter-gatherers. Then we discover farming, we settle down, we build villages, villages become cities, cities become civilizations. Writing appears, math develops, astronomy follows, and everything rises in a neat line toward the modern world. A straight upward staircase. And in that staircase, there's a key claim: civilization begins around 6,000 years ago. Before that, prehistory. A long, vague stretch where nothing truly complex is supposed to happen. But the more you look at the evidence, Göbekli Tepe, ancient astronomy, the global megalithic puzzle, the harder it becomes to keep that staircase intact. Because the record doesn't always look like a gradual climb. Sometimes it looks like sudden appearance, like a jump cut in a film. And that jump cut shows up in the first civilizations we call first. Take Sumer. Around the 4th millennium BC, the Sumerians appear in Mesopotamia, already carrying sophistication that should have taken a long time to develop. Writing, mathematics, law codes, astronomy, complex religious systems, monumental architecture, irrigation infrastructure, not learning, not starting, operating. And what makes this even stranger is that Sumerian culture doesn't present itself as an invention from scratch. Their own traditions speak of the Apkallu 7 sages, wise beings associated with waters, coming before the flood, and teaching civilization. Again, you can interpret that as myth. But notice the pattern knowledge comes from before, not created in the moment, delivered, inherited, remembered. Now Egypt. The unification of Egypt happens around 3100 BC. Within centuries, you have a civilization producing monumental stone architecture, advanced mathematics, a written language complex, astronomical observation and alignment skills so precise that later people still argue about how they achieved it. The Great Pyramid, built around 2500 BC, isn't a clumsy first attempt. It's a masterpiece. Its stones fit with astonishing precision. Its geometry is stable. Its cardinal alignment is incredibly accurate. Its internal structure reflects planning and engineering awareness that doesn't feel like early trial and error. It feels like mastery. And Egyptian traditions, again, don't frame that mastery as brand new. They frame it as inherited. Tied to Zep Tepi, the first time, an older era when foundational knowledge was established. Then the Indus Valley. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa appear with advanced urban planning grid streets, standardized weights drainage systems that many later cities didn't match. These aren't messy first cities. They look designed, and yet the Indus civilization is also mysterious, limited monumental temples, unclear evidence of kings or conquest, a writing system still undeciphered. It's like they built with competence, lived with organization, and then over time declined, perhaps due to climate shifts, river changes, or disruption. 3 civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, Indus, emerging within a relatively tight window of time and already showing complex knowledge. The textbook answer is gradual development, but the artifacts don't always show gradual development in the way we'd expect. Instead, the earliest phases sometimes look fully formed, and that leads to a quiet, uncomfortable possibility. What if the first civilizations weren't inventing civilization? What if they were restarting it? Because the cyclical model explains things the linear model struggles with. It explains why certain knowledge appears abruptly. It explains why myths consistently talk about knowledge being inherited from older ages. It explains why the oldest stonework in some places seems more impressive than what comes later, because later generations might be copying techniques they no longer fully understand. And you can see this pattern in stone. In multiple regions, the oldest megalithic work is often the most massive and the most precise. Later additions become smaller, rougher, less exact, like the knowledge degraded over time instead of improving. That's backward for a linear progress story. But it fits perfectly if you imagine survivors rebuilding with fragments, doing their best to replicate what they remember. And then we hit the biggest problem of all, the gaps. The timeline of prehistory isn't continuous. It's full of missing stretches, thousands of years, where we have very little, then sudden bursts of complexity. Now, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Archaeology is limited by what survives and what we dig, and we've dug only a tiny fraction of the planet. More importantly, the places where humans are most likely to have developed early complex societies, coasts, rivers, fertile lowlands, are exactly the places that were drowned as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. So, the linear story might be biased by survival. We see the inland highlands because they remain. We don't see the coastal foundations because they're underwater, which means we might be missing entire chapters simply because they're inaccessible. And there's another layer to this one that's even harder to process. Our genetics carry hints of missing populations. Modern DNA research has revealed that Homo sapiens interbred with other hominin groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly others. But some genetic signals suggest ghost populations groups we infer through DNA, but haven't identified through fossils. In other words, there were human lineages we don't fully know. We have traces of them in us, but not their bones, not their cities, not their tools. And if a catastrophe wiped out populations and drowned the places they lived, then those genetic ghosts make even more sense. So now the cyclical model stops sounding like a fantasy and starts sounding like a framework that matches the fractured record. Civilization rises, knowledge accumulates, astronomy develops, engineering methods refine, symbols and systems are established. Then catastrophe strikes: flood, fire, impact, ice, sea level rise, coastlines drown, cities vanish, survivors scatter to highlands and inland refuges, knowledge fragments, memory becomes myth, generations pass. Then from those fragments, civilizations emerge again suddenly because they weren't starting from zero. They were reconstructing, they were remembering. This is what restart means. It doesn't require a single global empire with one flag and one language. It could be smaller, a network of coastal cultures, a shared knowledge tradition, a set of techniques and sky observations passed along trade routes or migration pathways. Then that network collapses, and what remains are scattered heirs. And if that happened once, it could have happened multiple times. Because the planet has no obligation to keep our history safe. The Earth has been through massive shifts before. It will go through them again. And this is where Göbekli Tepe becomes the potential keystone. Because Göbekli Tepe sits right at the end of the last ice age's chaotic transition. It stands on high ground. It's built of stone. It's aligned to the sky. It's buried deliberately. It behaves like something designed to survive upheaval. So, when some people propose radical ages, tens of thousands, even 100,000 years, it's not because they want to be sensational. It's because Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit neatly into the Neolithic farmers invent religion storyline. It looks like a sophisticated project undertaken with purpose. And if it truly is older, if it truly predates the accepted date by a huge margin, then it forces a redefinition of what civilization even means. It suggests that what we call civilization may not be a one-time invention, but a repeating phase humans enter when conditions allow and lose when conditions collapse. And suddenly, the past stops being a straight line. It becomes a wheel, which leads to an even darker thought. Because if civilization is a cycle, if collapse is part of the pattern, then Göbekli Tepe isn't just an archaeological mystery. It's a warning, a monument from people who may have watched their world fall and tried to preserve something in stone because they knew the next world might forget. And that brings us back to the most haunting angle of all. What if Göbekli Tepe's builders weren't trying to show off? What if they were trying to communicate? If the carvings are symbolic, astronomical, and intentional, if the burial is preservation, then maybe the entire site is a message. Not a message in words, but in structure, in alignment, in mythic imagery. A message that says, this has happened before, the world can end, and memory matters. So the next question becomes very personal, very immediate. If our world collapsed, what would survive? What would future people find? And how would they interpret us? Because that's where Göbekli Tepe stops being just about the past and starts turning into a mirror. Let's do something unsettling for a moment. Imagine it's not 2025. Imagine it's 12,000 years from now. Our cities are gone. Not ruined in a cinematic way, gone. Skyscrapers collapsed into rubble. Steel rusted and flaked away. Concrete cracked, crumbled, and got swallowed by vegetation. Roads broke, disappeared under soil and roots. Digital storage failed long, long ago. The internet is a myth. Satellites fell, power grids died, and a future archaeologist, someone not quite like us but human enough to be curious, starts digging. What do they find? Fragments. A weird layer of plastics maybe, some glass, concrete chunks, scattered metal deposits, foundations, maybe the shells of tunnels. But would they find our libraries, our songs, our science? Would they find the sum of everything we think we've built? Probably not, because most of our knowledge lives in fragile forms. Data centers, hard drives, cloud storage servers that require constant energy to exist. We don't carve our understanding into stone. We don't build monuments designed to survive the end of the world. We build for convenience, for speed, for now. So the future archaeologist might look at the scattered rubble of our age and argue endlessly. Were these people advanced, or were they primitive? What did they believe? How did they think? And if they don't find obvious written records, if they don't decode what survives, our story could become speculation, myth, guesswork. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly where we are with Göbekli Tepe. A stone site that survives precisely because stone survives. A site buried, protected, sealed, almost as if its builders understood the difference between what lasts and what vanishes. Which raises a question that hits like a punch. What if Göbekli Tepe is a deliberate attempt to outlast collapse? Not just a temple, but a safeguard, a memory device. And if that's true, then the builders were thinking in time spans that modern people rarely consider. They were thinking about survival across ages. Now look back at the pillars. If these people were trying to preserve something, what did they choose to preserve? Animals, symbols, celestial patterns, orientation, geometry, not random choices. These are the categories you preserve if you're trying to encode a worldview, if you're trying to leave behind a map of the sky, of cycles of meaning. And that's why the site's silence feels heavy. It's not empty silence. It's the silence of something waiting to be understood, like a message written in a language we've forgotten how to read. Now here's the uncomfortable twist. If Göbekli Tepe is a warning, it might not be just a warning about the past. It might be a warning about the future, because catastrophe isn't a one-time event. The planet has cycles, the cosmos has cycles, climate has cycles, impacts happen, solar storms happen, sea levels rise and fall. The magnetic field shifts over time. And modern civilization, our civilization, depends on stability. Our entire global system assumes steady climate patterns, functioning supply chains, functioning grids, functioning satellites, functioning digital storage. We are unbelievably advanced and unbelievably fragile. A major solar storm could cripple electronics. A global conflict could disrupt infrastructure. Rapid climate instability could trigger mass migration and collapse of systems we take for granted. And if something like that happened, what would survive? Maybe some stone monuments, maybe some carved statues, maybe some deep-sealed structures. Not much else. So when you look at Göbekli Tepe, you're not just looking at a mystery, you're looking at a possible survival strategy from an older world. And that leads to the most haunting question we've been circling since the beginning. If Göbekli Tepe truly is older than we think, if it belongs to a deeper cycle, then who built it? Not as a name, not as a label, but as a type of people. What were they? What did they know? What did they fear? Because even if you don't accept extreme dates, like 100,000 years, the site still demands a serious explanation. It's too big, too organized, too deliberate to wave away as an accidental development of wandering groups who just decided to build a temple. So let's strip the question down to its core. What kind of society builds a complex like this? At minimum, a society capable of organizing large labor forces, coordinating complex construction projects, sustaining workers over long periods, maintaining shared symbolic meaning across groups, preserving specialized knowledge, stone carving, geometry alignment. That doesn't require modern technology, but it does require structure, continuity, cultural depth, and once you accept that the hunter-gatherer label becomes less useful. Because hunter-gatherer is a survival strategy, not an intelligence level. People can hunt and gather while still having deep knowledge, complex rituals, astronomy, and engineering traditions. So the debate isn't really primitive versus advanced. It's about scale and continuity. And Göbekli Tepe screams continuity. It looks like the result of a tradition, not an experiment, which makes the burial even more meaningful, because burying the site is like closing a book carefully, not ripping it apart, not leaving it in the rain, carefully, methodically, as if you want it to survive for someone else. So here's a possibility that threads all the evidence together. Göbekli Tepe might be the work of survivors, or descendants of survivors, of a world-ending event. A catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, remembered in myth as a flood and fire. Those survivors would have lost most of their world coastal lands, drowned networks, broken populations scattered. But they might have preserved fragments of their older knowledge, especially astronomy, because the sky is the one thing that stays consistent enough to rebuild your sense of order. They might have preserved sacred symbolic systems, animals as constellations, geometric codes, rituals tied to cycles. And on high ground safe from rising seas, they might have built Göbekli Tepe as a place to gather, preserve, and encode what remained. Then, fearing further disaster, or fearing that knowledge would be lost, they sealed it, buried it, protected it, a message in stone hidden under earth, waiting for a future age. And if that's true, then Göbekli Tepe's builders might have been doing something profoundly human, refusing to let their world vanish without leaving a trace, leaving behind not a diary, but a monument, not a book, but a pillar, not a timeline, but a symbol. Now this is where skeptics will say, but where are the cities? Where are the tools? Where is the rest of this civilization? And that's the right question. Because a monument like Göbekli Tepe implies a larger context. A culture doesn't do this in isolation. So if Göbekli Tepe is a fragment, then the larger world is missing. Which brings us back again to the sea. If the most likely early settlements were coastal, and those coastlines are now underwater, then the cities might literally be gone from our reach. Not erased by conspiracy, erased by geology, and that might be the greatest tragedy of archaeology. We may be missing the most important evidence simply because it's drowned, but something else might survive besides stone patterns. Repeating structures, shared obsessions, because even if the cities are gone, the blueprint might remain scattered across the world in the sites that did survive. High ground sites, stone sites, buried sites, and if Göbekli Tepe is part of a global pattern, then it becomes one node in a network of echoes, which means the last thing we have to do before we end this arc is return to the site itself and ask what it wants to be. Temple Observatory Library. Warning. Because depending on what Göbekli Tepe actually is, the entire interpretation changes. If it's a temple, the symbols might be spiritual. If it's an observatory, the symbols might be astronomical. If it's a library, the symbols might be informational. And if it's a warning, the symbols might be the only way the builders could say, "This happened before. Watch the sky. Remember." And that leads directly into the final layer of the mystery. If Göbekli Tepe was built to communicate across time, what exactly is the message? What is the riddle carved into the limestone? What are we supposed to read if we ever learn how? Because the stones have been patient. They've waited under the earth for thousands of years, maybe far longer. And they might still be waiting for us to finally understand what they've been trying to tell us. If Göbekli Tepe is a message, it's not written in words. It's written in choices, in what was carved, in what was emphasized, in what was aligned, in what was buried. Because when you strip away all the speculation and all the debate, you're left with one undeniable truth. This site was designed, not in the sense of someone stacked stones, designed in the sense of intentional planning, concept, layout, symbolism, placement, and closure. And when something is that intentional, you have to ask, intentional for what? Let's start with the most obvious interpretation: temple. That's the label mainstream archaeology often uses, and it's not unreasonable. The enclosures are circular, the pillars feel ceremonial, the imagery animals, abstract symbols, could be ritual, a gathering place for communities, a sacred center, a location where groups came together around shared belief. But temple can become a kind of box, a label you slap on anything that feels spiritual when you don't fully understand it. And Göbekli Tepe is one of those sites where the label might be true, but incomplete, because the structure behaves like more than worship. It behaves like a system. Each enclosure is arranged with its own internal logic pillars, positioned in relation to one another. Central pillars standing like paired figures, surrounding rings, repeated patterns of animal imagery. This doesn't feel random, it feels coded, and the animal choices matter. Lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, birds, especially vultures. Why these animals? One easy answer is they were important to people living in that environment. Sure. But there's another layer. Humans have always used animals for the sky. Many ancient cultures mapped constellations onto animals because it's how you remember patterns. The sky is abstract points of light until you give it story, give it shape, give it creature. So if Göbekli Tepe is encoding sky knowledge, animals are the perfect medium, not art for art's sake. A visual memory map. And if that's true, then Göbekli Tepe might function not just as a sacred site, but as an astronomical archive, a place where the heavens were recorded in stone. Which brings us back to Pillar 43, the vulture stone. If it's a star map, what is it mapping? Some researchers argue it could be recording a specific event, something in the sky that mattered so much it was carved permanently. An impact, a comet, a celestial catastrophe, a moment when the sky turned dangerous. Again, debated, controversial, but not absurd in concept. Because if the Younger Dryas boundary involved impacts or airbursts, and if survivors carried memory of fire from the sky, then encoding that memory into a star map would be one of the only ways to preserve it, not as a story that might change, but as a diagram that could be reread when the sky is rewound. In other words, a time-stamped warning. Here is what happened. Here is where it came from. Here is how to recognize it. Now, whether Göbekli Tepe was meant as warning or not, the astronomical obsession is hard to ignore. Precession is a clock. Solstices are a calendar. Heliacal risings mark seasons. The sky provides order when the earth becomes chaotic. And if a culture lived through catastrophe, the sky would become both comfort and threat. Comfort because it stays patterned. Threat because it can send fire. So now the question becomes less abstract. If Göbekli Tepe encodes astronomy, is it encoding time? Because time is the one thing you'd want to preserve if you're trying to communicate across ages. Not who we were, but when. When we lived, when disaster struck, when cycles turn. Now look at the burial again. If this was a temple, why bury it? If it was an observatory, why bury it? If it was a library, why bury it? Because burial turns the site into something else, a capsule. It ensures the site is not just built, but preserved. And that implies forethought, which implies that whoever sealed it believed future humans, future people would exist. That there would be a next age, that someone would return. And the burial is what makes that feel like more than ritual. Ritual closure is about ending something. Preservation burial is about continuing something through time. So maybe the enclosures weren't meant to be used indefinitely. Maybe they were meant to be sealed at a certain point, like closing a vault. And if that's the case, then the site might be operating on the logic of cycles. Build it, use it, encode what matters, seal it, wait. Now, if that interpretation feels like a leap, let's ground it in something simple. Humans do this. Even today, we create archives designed to outlast catastrophe. We build seed vaults. We bury time capsules. We store data in deep bunkers. We carve warnings around nuclear waste sites with symbols meant to be understood by people who might not speak our languages. We do this because we understand something ancient people understood too. The future is not guaranteed, and when the future is not guaranteed, you preserve what you can. So, it's not crazy to think Göbekli Tepe might be serving a similar purpose for its builders. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. Because once you start thinking of Göbekli Tepe as a preserved message, you end up facing a bigger implication. The message might not be meant for their immediate neighbors. It might be meant for us. Not us personally, but a distant civilization, one far enough removed that the site would be forgotten, that the knowledge would degrade, that the next builders would restart civilization and wonder where it all began. That's the haunting possibility Göbekli Tepe might have been built for a world after collapse. And if so, then the builders had a kind of grim optimism. They believed something would survive, even if they didn't. Now, what would that kind of culture choose to preserve? Not personal names, not kings, not politics. Those are fragile and context-bound. They would preserve fundamentals, cycles, sky patterns, symbols of life and death, animal archetypes, geometric forms. And that's exactly what we see. Which brings us to a terrifyingly simple interpretation. Göbekli Tepe might be a survival manual encoded in stone. Not a manual in the modern sense. No, step 1, step 2. But an encoded memory of key knowledge. How to track time through the sky. How to align structures to cardinal directions, zones. And solstices, how to remember a disaster and recognize its signs. How to keep a worldview intact across generations. How to preserve knowledge when everything collapses. If you're rebuilding civilization, those things matter. They help you restore agriculture calendars. They help you predict seasons. They help you orient sacred space and social order. They help you anchor your culture in cycles bigger than human lifespans. And that takes us back to the cyclical model of history. If civilizations have risen before and fallen before, then the most valuable inheritance isn't luxury. It's structure, it's timekeeping, it's astronomy, it's architecture, it's the ability to rebuild. And if survivors of a collapse wanted to make sure the next age had a chance, leaving a stone archive makes perfect sense. Now, even if you reject the idea of a global lost civilization, Göbekli Tepe still forces a serious rethink. Because at minimum, it proves that complex symbolic and monumental behavior existed earlier than the old story allowed. And if that's true, then it's not hard to imagine other knowledge existing earlier, too, especially if much of the evidence is underwater or destroyed. So where does that leave us, standing in the wind on the Anatolian plateau, looking at pillars that shouldn't exist in the timeline they're assigned, carved with animals that might be constellations sealed under earth, as if preservation mattered? And if the site is a message, it leaves us with one final question that sits like a weight in the chest. What did they fear? Because you don't build something like this, then bury it unless you believe something is coming. Whether that something was a climate collapse, rising seas, social collapse, or fire from the sky, the builders acted as though the world could end fast, which is the same lesson geology gives us, and the same lesson myths keep repeating. So maybe Göbekli Tepe isn't just a mystery from the past. Maybe it's a reminder that our world, like theirs, is not permanent. And if they carved a warning into stone and buried it for the next age, then the warning is meant for anyone living in an age confident it will last. Which brings us to the closing thought of this entire arc. Even if we never prove Göbekli Tepe is 100,000 years old, even if we never decode every symbol, even if mainstream timelines remain mostly intact, Göbekli Tepe still whispers a truth that's hard to escape. Humanity is older, deeper, and more complex than we've been taught. And the cycle, rise, collapse, rebuild might be the real story beneath everything. So, the next time you look up at the stars tonight, remember, those stars have watched worlds end before. And if Göbekli Tepe is right, if its builders were trying to tell us something, then the most dangerous thing we can do is assume we're the first, or assume we'll be the last, because the stones have already proven they can outlast empires. The question is whether we can outlast our own certainty. Let's come back to where we started, back to the cold wind on that plateau, back to the pillars standing like shadows against the night. Because after everything we've traced, the stonework, the astronomy, the burial, the catastrophe, the patterns across the world, the myths that echo the same disasters, we're left with a strange feeling. Not certainty, not proof, but pressure. Like Göbekli Tepe is pushing against the walls of the story we've been taught until something has to give. And I think that's the real reason this site fascinates people so deeply. It isn't just because it's old, it's because it makes the timeline feel brittle. We like human history when it's tidy. We like when the past is a straight line, primitive, to advanced darkness, to light caves, to cities. Göbekli Tepe sits there like a stone contradiction. Because even if you accept the mainstream date roughly 11,000 years ago, it's still too early for what it is. It still shows monumental planning before agriculture supposedly should support it. It still shows symbolic complexity that feels like a matured tradition. It still shows labor coordination on a scale that shouldn't exist for small mobile bands without permanent infrastructure. And it still shows deliberate burial, which is the part that never stops being eerie. So the site forces us into one of two uncomfortable realities. Either Our assumptions about early humans are wrong. Humans were capable of much more, much earlier, even without agriculture. Or the site is part of a deeper cycle, some form of inherited knowledge, some continuity from an older age, some memory surviving catastrophe. Both options are disruptive. And maybe that's why the debate gets so heated. Because it's not just academic, it touches identity. If humans were complex earlier than we thought, then the progress story becomes less clean. If civilization is cyclical, then first civilizations become restarts, not beginnings. If catastrophic resets happen before, then collapse is not an exception, it's part of the pattern. And that thought isn't just about the past, it's about us. Because if there's one lesson Göbekli Tepe seems to carry, whether intentionally or not, it's that permanence is an illusion. Empires vanish, cities drown, knowledge fragments, memory becomes myth. All that survives is what's built to survive. Stone and story. So, when you stand in the shadow of these pillars, you start to wonder, what did the builders think about time? Because the site isn't built like something meant to last a season. It isn't built like something meant to be used for a generation and forgotten. It feels like it was built with deep time in mind. And if the astronomical interpretations have even a sliver of truth, if the carvings point to a sky configuration that predates the official date, then that deep time mindset becomes even more real. It means someone somewhere was thinking in spans larger than human lifetimes. Spans large enough that civilization itself becomes just one phase of the cycle. Which brings us to the central question we've been circling, like a slow orbit. If Göbekli Tepe is a fragment of a world far older than we've been taught, what were its builders trying to tell us? Here's a possibility, and I want you to feel how heavy it is. Maybe they were trying to tell us that the sky is the calendar of catastrophe, that the heavens are not only beautiful, they're also dangerous. If cosmic events played a role in the Younger Dryas boundary, then survivors would remember not just the flood, but the sky. Fire, impact, light, darkness. The sky turning into a weapon. And if you survive something like that, you would never look up the same way again. You would watch for signs. You would mark patterns. You would encode constellations and alignments because you'd believe the sky holds the key to both time and threat. And you would carve that knowledge into something that could last. Now maybe that's too dramatic. Maybe Göbekli Tepe was simply a spiritual center, a social hub, a place where early humans gathered, bonded, feasted, and created meaning. That could absolutely be true. But even then, the burial still stands there, like a locked door. Why seal it? Why hide it? Why bury what you built with such effort? That's the action that refuses to sit quietly, because burying it suggests fear, or foresight, or both. And once you accept that another thought appears, one that makes modern people uneasy, what if the builders buried the site not because it was sacred, but because it was powerful? Because knowledge can be sacred and dangerous at the same time. If Göbekli Tepe encoded astronomical cycles, if it preserved timing knowledge, if it anchored rituals tied to seasons and survival, then it would be power. Power over agriculture, calendars, over gatherings, over social cohesion, over worldview. And in a collapsing world, power attracts desperation. So burial could be protection from disaster, yes, but also from people, from enemies, from chaos, from those who would misuse what was preserved. Now again, we're in speculation territory. But it's a grounded kind of speculation because burial is a grounded fact. Something happened that made humans decide the site should not remain open. And that decision is the hinge of the entire mystery. Because if the burial happened during or near an age of upheaval, then Göbekli Tepe might be a deliberate response to instability. An attempt to freeze a culture's core identity in stone and seal it away so it could survive what was coming. If that's true, then the site becomes less like the world's first temple and more like a vault, a library, a memorial, a warning marker, a last stand of memory. And that returns us to the cyclical model in a way that feels almost unavoidable. Because once you see human history as cycles, you realize something that changes how you look at everything. The first thing a post-collapse world loses is continuity. You might keep skills, but you lose coordination. You might keep myths, but you lose specifics. You might keep fragments of knowledge, but you lose the framework that holds it together. So, survivors rebuild from fragments. They recreate writing, they recreate astronomy, they recreate social structures. And when they do, the results can look like sudden inventions in the record. Because we're not seeing the long development that existed before the collapse. We're seeing the restart, and if that's the real shape of history, then Göbekli Tepe might be one of the rare places where the restart point is literally preserved, a bridge between worlds, a physical hinge between before and after. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with humility, because Göbekli Tepe isn't just about proving a date. It's about recognizing how little of the past we actually have, how much is drowned, how much is eroded, how much is still buried, how much is locked behind the limits of what we can excavate, map, and understand. It leaves us realizing that the official timeline is not a complete story. It's a draft based on what survived and what's been found so far. And as new evidence appears, drafts change. Now I want to take you back to the first image we opened with night. Stars, wind, stone. Because no matter what side of the debate you fall on, those pillars are real. The carvings are real. The burial is real. And the fact that we're still arguing about what it means is the most important part. It means the site is still alive in the sense that it continues to challenge us. It keeps the question open. And that question, more than any single theory, might be what matters most. What if everything we think we know about our beginnings is incomplete? What if there are older chapters, older cycles, older collapses, older civilizations whose footprints are scattered under the sea and under the soil? And what if Göbekli Tepe is one of the few surviving messages from that erased world? A message not written in words, but carved into limestone. We were here. We knew the sky. We built in stone. And when the world changed, we buried this so you might someday find it. So, as we approach the end of this series arc, here's what I want you to carry with you. Whether Göbekli Tepe is 11,000 years old or far older, it proves that humans are capable of far more than we often assume. It proves that history is more fragile than we're comfortable admitting. And it suggests that the line between myth and memory might be thinner than we've been taught. Which sets up the final part of this rewrite, the closing statement, the moment where everything we've explored collapses into one final echoing question. Because at the end of the night, under the same stars that watch those pillars rise, there's only one thing left to ask. If Göbekli Tepe is a warning from a forgotten world, are we listening? Night returns to the Anatolian plateau. The wind moves slowly across the hills of southeastern Turkey, carrying the scent of dry earth and wild thyme. Above the stars burn cold and bright, unbothered by our debates, indifferent to our certainty, patient in a way only the cosmos can be. And beneath those stars stands Göbekli Tepe, T-shaped pillars rising from the earth like sentinels frozen in time, half revealed, half buried, as if the site itself can't decide whether it wants to be found or wants to remain hidden. We've followed the trail as far as the evidence allows, thread by thread, clue by clue, into a past that refuses to stay neatly contained inside the story we've been handed. We've looked at the stonework's smooth surfaces, sharp edges, deep reliefs carved with confidence, animals rendered with accuracy, symbols repeated with intention, craft that doesn't feel like first attempts, but like practiced hands executing something they already understood. We've stared at the scale pillars weighing tons, quarried, transported, raised upright into sockets, carved into bedrock, accomplished without wheels, without metal tools, without machines, by people. The timeline labels simple. We've listened to the sky, the slow drift of stars through precession, the way constellations shift over millennia, and the unsettling possibility that some carvings may align better with older skies than the accepted date would allow. We've confronted the burial, not chaotic erosion, not random sediment, but deliberate fill-layered, compacted systematic, like sealing a vault. A decision, a closing act. We've traced catastrophe. The Younger Dryas' abrupt climate reversal ecosystem collapse, rising seas that drowned entire coastlines. A world reshaped in a geological blink. A kind of event capable of erasing not only people, but their cities, their roads, their record, their memory. We've compared global echoes, other places where stonework seems too precise, too massive, too engineered sites scattered across continents that share symbols, alignments, and mysteries that feel less like coincidence and more like fragments of something bigger. We've listened to mythology stories of floods and fire from the sky of ages before this one of worlds reset and survivors rebuilding tales dismissed as fiction for centuries, yet hauntingly aligned with the kind of events geology confirms have happened. And through all of it, one thought keeps returning like a heartbeat in the dark. What if the story of human history is not linear? What if it's cyclical rise, collapse, rebuild, again and again? If Göbekli Tepe truly belongs to a deeper cycle, if it's older than we've been taught, then it isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It's a crack in the foundation of our identity. Because it would mean that long before Sumer, long before Egypt, long before the Indus Valley, long before the first civilizations, we celebrate humans were already building, already observing, already organizing, already carving meaning into stone. And then something happened, something big enough to erase them. And maybe what we call the dawn of civilization is not the first sunrise, but the sunrise after the storm. A restart, a recovery, a rebuilding from fragments of a world that fell. And even if you don't accept extreme ages, 20,000 years, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, Göbekli Tepe still refuses to be comfortably explained. Because even at 11,000 years old, it stands too early, too complex, too intentional to fit inside the old story without forcing us to rewrite parts of it. So maybe the most honest conclusion is not certainty, but humility. We don't know everything. We have not excavated everything. We have not mapped the drowned landscapes where early people likely lived. We have not decoded the symbolic language carved into those pillars. And we have barely begun to understand how much of our past is still buried under earth, under water, under the assumptions we inherited. But the stones remain, silent, patient, and that patience feels like a message all by itself. Because stone doesn't hurry, stone waits. And if Göbekli Tepe was built to survive upheaval, if it was sealed so it could outlast disaster, then its builders were thinking beyond their own lifetimes. They were thinking in cycles. They were thinking about the next age. They may have believed the world they lived in was ending. And if they believed that, then the act of carving into limestone makes sense. When everything else is vulnerable woodcloth, memory spoken language stone is the last option. Stone is what you choose when you want something to survive you. And what did they choose to carve? Not names, not kings, not politics. They carved animals, symbols, and celestial patterns, as if time, nature, and the sky were the real constants worth preserving. As if those were the keys to rebuilding. As if those were the keys to remembering. And now, thousands of years later, we stand here, modern, connected, confident, looking at the same pillars under the same stars. And we're forced into a question that isn't just about archaeology. It's about us. Because whether Göbekli Tepe is a temple, an observatory, a library, a warning, or all of the above, it still speaks one truth clearly. Civilization is not guaranteed. It can vanish. And if it vanishes, the future will only know what survives. So look at our world for a moment. We store our knowledge in digital clouds that vanish without electricity. We build cities dependent on delicate systems. We assume the grid will hold. We assume stability is normal. We assume the future will look like a continuation of the present. But the planet has never promised that. And the sky, beautiful as it is, has never promised that either. If there's a warning buried in the story of Göbekli Tepe, it might be this: don't mistake your era for permanence. Don't mistake your timeline for the full truth. Don't confuse what you've been taught with what actually happened. And don't assume you're the first or the last, because the stars above you have watched worlds end before, and the stones beneath you may be the proof. So, here's the question I want to leave ringing in the silence after this video ends, after the screen goes dark, and you're alone with the night again. If Göbekli Tepe truly stands as a fragment of a far older world, what were its builders trying to tell us? And what did they fear we might forget? Drop your thoughts below, especially if you've been looking up at the stars differently since this started. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you want to keep going deeper into what else might be buried beneath our accepted history, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on. Because the truth is, Göbekli Tepe is not the end of the mystery. It's the beginning of the questions. And the questions are what pull buried worlds back into the light.